People were saying, I'm originally from Austria. I hope you'll forgive me that I'll talk in English today. I'll be taking any questions in German, of course. And as people were saying, I will be talking about making and hacking and what that all has to do with China today. But I want to start out with this image here. So what you see here on the screen is the world's first open source phone. In September 2015, Seed Studio, an open source hardware design and production company in Shenzhen, a city in the south of China, just a subway ride north of Hong Kong, released this open source phone on Kickstarter. The RePhone, in that sense, is an open source phone kit. That means it's comprised of modules of bundled functionality that can be plugged together to assemble a phone of one's liking. So you could, for example, create a phone with 3 SIM cards, or a phone with 2 cameras or 3 cameras, or a phone that looks like the way you want it with a unique shell. In their 2015 Kickstarter campaign, the open source hardware company positioned the device as follows. What if we designed a phone to be anything we want to be? For the last 8 years in Shenzhen, Seed Studio has been busy hacking the electronic supply chain to make advanced tools and technologies available to everyone. The result is the RePhone. By packaging processes of complex manufacturing into a set of open components in the RePhone, the phone itself functions like a magnifying glass, a detailed, albeit crude glimpse into a select aspects of complex industrial production in the south of China today. So the making of the RePhone, in that sense, I argue, serves an epistemic function. That means it offers lines of thinking about designing and producing through the social and material fabric of the city of Shenzhen. So in this talk today, my goal is to do 2 things. First, I'll unpack how the open source phone was an essential part of a much larger, a much bigger project of China's makers to open up the black box of contemporary industrial production in China today. The RePhone, in other words, was designed to translate both the social and the technological aspects and complexity of industrial production into a technological vernacular that was familiar to a transnational network of geeks, makers, designers, artists, and other people who've begun endorse the global maker movement. And then second, my goal in this talk today is to unpack how in this process of hacking Shenzhen's electronic supply chain, the phrase that Seed Studio used in the Kickstarter campaign, the city of Shenzhen, and with it the nation itself, became the design material for its very own upgrade as a global innovation and knowledge economy. So in other words, I'll show you how China itself was hacked. And here by hacking, I don't refer to its more negative connotations of illegally hacking into a system, but the way in which open source thinkers typically refer to hacking as an opening up of the black box of enclosed systems from technology to nation states. So a little bit of a background, why am I here talking to you about this? I've been doing research in China over the last 6 years. I'm mostly drawing here from ethnographic methods, which means that I'm deeply embedded in situated cultures. So in my case, this included being an active member of some of China's first hacker and maker spaces that opened in 2010, and you can see some photos here on the screen. And ethnographic research usually involves participant observation and interviews, but in my case, I also participated actively in the making and designing of projects and prototypes and open source hardware platforms. I actually have a background from a college in Austria, Hagenberg, and my degree was in media technology and design, and so design practice is a very active part of my research itself. In 2013, as part of this longer 6-year-long research project, I also participated as a researcher and ethnographer embedded in a startup who came all the way from Canada to Shenzhen to turn an idea in open hardware into a product by partnering with factories in Shenzhen and on the ground. So I was embedded with them for a year, and that also then meant, you can see on the screen, going into factories and watching and participating in how a startup actually negotiates with a Chinese factory. So I'll be drawing from this large data set today. A big part of my research over the last years has also been the partnership with colleagues and researchers and other makers in the hosting of workshops and conferences. And here on the screen are just some photos from one of these events that took place in Salzburg at the university there about a year ago in collaboration with the HCI group. And this is, just to sort of like envision and sort of unpack in practice how making and technology production today includes a diversity of people. So there's a variety of actors involved, including academics, entrepreneurs, designers, artists, critical thinkers, big corporations like Intel and so on. And the goal of these workshops and conferences was to understand why so many different and very diverse actors from a big corporation like Intel all the way to a grassroots tinkerer come together about this topic. So I'll be drawing from this larger body of research today, but I want to begin by introducing you to Eric Pan, who you can see here on the screen. It's a person I've been working with quite extensively. So in 2008, so this is about 7 years before the Rephone came on the market. So I should mention, Eric Pan was actually the creator of the Rephone that I introduced at the beginning of my talk. So 7 years before Eric implemented and designed the Rephone, he quit his job as an electrical engineer at Intel in Chengdu and moved to Beijing, where some of his friends in the arts needed help with the technical implementation and the electronic wiring of their interactive installations. Some of the artists, to Eric's surprise, had gone quite far on their own to work out some of the technical and basic engineering components of their interactive pieces. What they were all using, Eric discovered, was a small electronic board about the size of a hand called the Arduino. Can I get a showing of hands? Who knows what an Arduino board is? Okay, so you have like 8 people, something like that. Okay, so just briefly, the Arduino is an open source microcontroller platform that came out of a collective project at the Ivrea Design Institute in Italy only 2 years before Eric discovered it in Beijing in 2008. The Arduino today is often considered one of the cornerstone platforms that enabled many people to tinker not only with software, but also with hardware. And so it's very often understood as one of the key platforms that enabled the global maker movement. So by lowering the cost of hardware and by making it open source, the Arduino had significantly lowered the barriers of entry for people who don't necessarily have an engineering degree to nevertheless tinker with hardware. And yet, a fundamental hurdle seemed to remain, Eric noticed when he met with the artists in Beijing. Many people still relied on the support of engineers and Chinese manufacturers to complete their work and to move from prototype into finished project, no matter if that was an art installation or a consumer product. It was Eric had an idea. He told me later in an interview, what if we brought together the power of open source hardware with the expertise and capacity of Chinese manufacturing? What would happen then? It was this idea of bringing together Chinese expertise in manufacturing and open source hardware values and principles and projects that should become the core business model of Eric Pan's new company called Seed Studio. So similar to the company Arduino in Italy, Seed Studio makes open source hardware platforms and maker kits, like I've shown earlier the Arduino. But in addition, it also offers services for makers and other hardware enthusiasts who want to move from open source hardware tinkering into production. So Eric had initially started this project in Beijing, but the company really began to thrive when he moved to the city of Shenzhen in the south of China. And one of the first products, just a couple of months after Eric had moved to Shenzhen, that the company released was the Seedwino, which you see here on the right in red. So the Seedwino was basically built on the Arduino board, the left one in blue, but extended it in important ways. It offered additional features, such as a small USB connector, a small external power, a switch to manually select a power source, and other add-ons to significantly increase the performance of the board. In addition, the new Seedwino board was offered at a lower price. It was actually 20% cheaper than the Arduino board on the market on the left at that time. How did Seed Studio do this? To do this, Seed Studio had begun to what the company should later call, in their Kickstarter campaign with which I began this talk, to hack the electronic supply chain. So what does it mean, actually, for a small company like Seed Studio, was only like about 10 people at that time, to hack the electronic supply chain of one of the largest electronic manufacturers in the world? you see here a map of Shenzhen. You can see how the city is just north of Hong Kong, and what you see here in red, these tiny dots are all manufacturing entities. So basically what it meant for Seed to hack the electronic supply chain was to build partnerships with factories, traders, assembly lines, vendors, and component producers, these little dots, and there's way more than even on this map, in this wider region of Guangdong, that's the region around Shenzhen. And in building these partnerships with these factories and component producers and other entities, Seed Studio had basically begun to open up what had remained before a black box of electronics manufacturing. So while the Arduino board lowered the barriers of entry for people to tinker with and prototype hardware, the Seeduino had further extended this approach and additionally also lowered the barriers of entry for people to move from prototyping into production. So this business model of a translational work, you might say, between designers and manufacturers proved quite successful. Seed Studio started out in the beginning as only a 2-people business, but then within only 2 years grew into a 200-people company with revenue in the tens of millions US dollars. The company had, in other words, made a name for itself, especially in Europe and in the United States. Many makers agreed that Seed Studio followed one of the core principles of open source to build on and improve on other people's work while acknowledging the previous creator. And yet Seed appeared all but what people in the West typically think of when they think about a Chinese company. In a 2013 interview, Eric told me, when I came to the United States in 2010, people there knew us and liked our products, but nobody wanted to believe that we are a Chinese company. Nobody had thought that cool and innovative products could come out of China. So when Eric returned to China, he decided it was time to rework this image about China and Chinese manufacturing in particular. It was then when the company replaced the common made in China label that you see on most of your products with an alternative, innovate with China, as you can see here on the screen. We wanted to demonstrate, Eric told me, that manufacturing in China can mean something else than just cheap labor and low quality, but it can also mean partnership and innovation. So the making of open source devices, like the RePhone with which I began my talk, and the Seeduino, became, in other words, and this is really Eric's project here, in a much larger project to intervene in what people today think about China and make of China. And this is really a project that I want to show you in this talk today. Many of China's makers have become embedded in and sort of got behind with. So side by side, the open source phone and the Seeduino, China's makers have produced several artifacts that have performed this translational work aimed at bringing people closer to the actual practices of design and manufacturing in Shenzhen. This is one of them. This is the Shenzhen map for makers. It was produced by a collective of makers in 2011. And the Shenzhen map for makers basically renders visible an otherwise largely invisible network of both small to very large-scale manufacturing entities throughout the Pearl River Delta, so throughout that region in the south of China. It's, so to say, a navigational guide into Shenzhen. Artifacts like this map and projects like the open source phone have rendered the city legible for people like Zach Smith, the co-founder of the internationally well-known New York-based 3D printing company that some of you might know, MakerBot. Zach articulates sort of this vision of Shenzhen as a unique site of making, as living in Shenzhen is like living in a city-sized tech shop. So through articulations like this Shenzhen, that's a unique space for makers, projects of mapping and the making of new toolkits like the open source RePhone, it's the city of Shenzhen itself, I argue, that is rendered a laboratory to turn ideas in open hardware, Internet of Things, robotics, and so on into end consumer projects or products. So the city itself, the whole city, becomes itself the laboratory again. And you can really see here that through the map of the city, it's the city that is the laboratory, right? It's not the makerspace, it's the city itself where you hack and make things. But what exactly was it about Shenzhen that made it so enticing as a laboratory for makers like Zach to not only envision but build a generation of open source hardware devices? To understand, we actually have to look back into the history of Shenzhen, and I want to give you a brief glimpse into what Shenzhen actually is. Can I just get a brief showing of hands again of who has been to Shenzhen before? 3 people. I would love to talk with you afterwards. So this is how Shenzhen looks like today. It's a 22 million people metropolis, as I mentioned, just north of Hong Kong. But Shenzhen did not always look like that. Shenzhen actually only had a population of 50,000 people 30 years ago. This began to drastically change in 1979 when the region became declared a special economic zone by Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese president at that time, which made it an experimental zone to implement China's own version of economic opening up, and you could say China's own version of capitalism, after China opened in the 80s. So the growth of Shenzhen then coincided with and was propelled by an outsourcing boom in the United States and in Europe that brought with it that IT companies, both in Europe and the United States, moved their manufacturing to regions like Shenzhen. And this was enabled because the region was a special economic zone and offered reduced taxes and other incentives for foreign companies to invest in the region. So with the gradual upgrade of technological and organizational skills over the following sort of continuing 10 years, also what happened was a process of vertical reintegration. So what I mean by this is companies that were producing for largely Western corporations began over time developing their own products. And most of you probably know this is the HTC that was developed by an ODM, by a contract manufacturer as their own device. So to most people, Shenzhen is known, if it is known at all, through stories of invisible labor, and mostly the story focuses on one single factory, the Taiwanese Foxconn, and New York Times headlines about worker suicides at Foxconn. But very few people actually know about Shenzhen and about its history and what happened in these 30 years in addition to these large contract manufacturers that produced for Apple and HP. So I'm going to give you a glimpse into what else happened in Shenzhen over the last 30 years. So as contract manufacturers grew in size, so think again, Foxconn and HTC, at first small network of entrepreneurs began seeing an opportunity to establish themselves in the gaps of the global economy. So they basically began catering for clients who the big contract manufacturers had not targeted. So think about companies that are smaller than Apple, Nokia, or HP. So companies that might only want to produce in the 50,000s instead of the millions. So a network of entrepreneurs, of people who knew about manufacturing, started their own companies and basically built an informal manufacturing ecosystem that grew in the shadows of this very official manufacturing ecosystem that we know today, again, producing for Apple. This less formal manufacturing ecosystem is very often referred to in Chinese as zhanzhai, and you can see the spelling here on the screen. And what it refers to is basically a horizontal web of component producers, traders, and design solution houses that began collaboratively working together in a spirit of openness. So they began openly sharing the resources in order to be competitive with the larger players like Foxconn and so on. So you might wonder what zhanzhai actually means in English. Zhanzhai translates into English as mountain stronghold or mountain fortress. And so it connotes an informal outlaw tradition. The term has been in use in China for quite some time and features most prominently in folk stories that tells of the adventures of 108 rebels, and you can see them here on the screen, who were hiding in the mountains and take from the emperor. So it's kind of like a Robin Hood story. And there's an element of criminality about zhanzhai, just like Robin Hood was kind of like an outlaw, but it's really about autonomy, about independence, and very progressive survival techniques. The term was first applied to manufacturing in the 1950s to describe small-scale family-run factories in Hong Kong that produced cheap and low-quality household items in order to mark their position outside of the official economic order. So these companies produced, for example, some of the well-known copycats of Gucci and Nike, and you can see some of them here on the screen. So the idea was zhanzhai as a counterculture would describe this network of factories who were catering not for the elite who could afford a Gucci bag, but for a large market who could otherwise not afford an expensive brand. And that's why this sort of countercultural ethos of zhanzhai was used to describe this particular phenomenon. As electronic manufacturing migrated to Shenzhen in the 80s, this informal network of zhanzhai manufacturing found a perfect product in the mobile phone. So Shanghai production today includes not only copycat production of the latest iPhone, but also new creations, like some of them here on the screen. So this is, for example, a phone here that you can see on the left, on the bottom, that was designed with 8 built-in speakers, which was designed for construction workers, for them to listen to music while they're working. It was also that out of this region actually came the first mobile phone with 2 SIM card slots, which was later actually copied by Nokia. So Shanghai in that itself started basically targeting markets that weren't really tapped by international companies yet. And the products began, not just being designed for migrant populations who couldn't afford expensive devices, but also new markets in Africa and India and Latin America. So it grew out of a very small entrepreneurial network of people, but is now a very, very big industry. And I just wanted to show you some of the more humorous creations that have come out of the Shanghai ecosystem. This is some of the devices I found in the electronic markets of Shenzhen. So on the left here, you can see a phone that also looks like a Chinese alcohol bottle. And on the right, there's a phone that also functions like a flashlight and a radio. And this one is one of my favorites. The vendor who sold it to me told me sort of, humorously, this was a year ago, that this is the latest iPhone 6. But these devices are just one example of really a much larger sort of infrastructure. So the region has now also begun producing smartphones for regions in, as I mentioned earlier, Africa. And this is one of the most successful companies now in Africa, and it's based out of Shenzhen. It's called Techno Mobile, specifically targeting, as you can see here in this ad, for the African market. In this case, the phone comes designed with a camera that captures dark-skinned subjects particularly well in dark settings, with most of our Apple iPhones and other devices don't do. So how was this possible? In my research, I was intrigued. Who makes these devices? How are they being produced? Produced by these large contract manufacturers. How is it possible to create a device like this? All the phones you saw on the previous screens basically contain a platform, a board, that is either the same or derivative version, like this one here on the screen. It is an open reference board used in manufacturing in Shenzhen to produce these devices. And you could compare this open board with the open source hardware platform like the Arduino that I just described at the beginning of my talk. So just like the Arduino enabled thousands of designers and artists and makers to build their own hardware, the open reference board enabled thousands of factories and entrepreneurs in China to build their own mobile devices. So it is basically an open source spirit applied to manufacturing. So the board is completely open, you know exactly what's in it, and you can change it and modify it very quickly and easily. And this is exactly why you have seen, actually, within a very short period of time, that these companies were able to produce a variety of devices that were competing with Western established companies. And it is also exactly this open source culture of production that enabled people like Eric Pan, who I introduced at the beginning, to envision and build alternative open hardware projects like the WePhone. And it was exactly in this moment when Eric took up and partnered with this open culture of production in manufacturing in Shenzhen that he was also participating, and as I mentioned earlier, in a project to really intervene in and change how we think about production and China today. So typically when we think about innovation, we think about something like this, which is emblazoned on the back of our iPhone, which is a binary split that says, designed by Apple in California and assembled in China. So here design is split along geographical lines, whereas design and creativity happens in the West, and its execution happens in China. And it is exactly this image that Eric and other people in China were committed to intervene in and to say, there's something else that happens in China, there's something else than just numb execution as Apple wants you to see it. All of these efforts of remaking China, of hacking China that China's makers were so passionate to intervene in, has not gone unnoticed by larger players. In 2015, Chinese politicians began to take notice. And sorry, you can see here actually on the screen, on the right, you see in the middle, a man. This is actually Chinese Prime Minister Li Keqiang, and he visits one of China's first hacker spaces here, called Chaihuo. And he's standing here surrounded by makers, Eric being one of them. And he basically visits that hackerspace. This is a first in China. You've never seen a Chinese politician in a grassroots community space in China before. This was really a first. Li Keqiang then returns to Beijing and declares a new national policy called, sort of loosely translated in English, mass makerspace, mass entrepreneurship, or mass innovation. So the vision behind this policy was by setting up makerspaces all over China and by retraining China's existing workforce to adopt a maker mindset, entrepreneurship and innovation thinking could be spread to many, many people, literally to masses of people in China. So this notion of making as, able to cultivate a particular kind of entrepreneurial ethos and upgrade old industries into more innovative ones is of course not unique to China, but has really, has many equivalents around the world, and people already mentioned this. This is just one example of a continuous effort by the Obama administration in the United States. Obama has, since 2012, been hosting maker fairs at the White House. And also here, Obama actually stipulates maker spaces and fab labs as a means to guarantee that the next revolution in manufacturing will be made in America. And you see similar efforts here also in Europe, where making is envisioned to enable a larger digitization project of old manufacturing industries and to bring innovation thinking to all kinds of new industries and old industries. In China, the endorsement of making and hacking marked a significant shift in governance, though, that basically stipulated that the future of China rested on its millions of citizens to transform themselves into entrepreneurial citizens. So when the Chinese government began its Maker Initiative, it in that sense envisioned a transformation of earlier visions that really started in China around 2008 to transform the nation from a producer into an innovator, into a global knowledge economy, and to at last become finally competitive with United States and Europe as an innovation and knowledge economy, and to be seen just as modern, as innovative as these Western regions. So making and this new policy really became seen as an opportunity to finally implement this longer vision to change China in the global imaginary and to enable many other people to see China as an innovator. So in part, this was so important for China because of what the Chinese government calls the new normal. The new normal is referring to a state of altered social and economic and political conditions due to what some have described as the first significant slowdown of China's vast economic growth since the 1980s. So China's new normal refers to a situation of heightened instability, precarious work and life conditions, and a drastic increase in what Kurvilla, Lee, and Gallagher called the informalization of work. So an increase in work conditions that comes without social security, what you might also be familiar with as part of the creative economy in the UK and in the US. So an increasingly precarious condition of life. So when the Chinese government endorsed making, it saw it as a way to address this exact issue and to say, how can we, in a moment of increased insecurity and unemployment, get people back to work? The idea was to transform people into entrepreneurs, to not just build technologies, but basically build their own jobs. Contrary to the focus on newness that surrounds much of making, this idea that entrepreneurship and an experiment in entrepreneurship can be the future for the nation is not all that new. So you see on the screen actually a photo of Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s when he declared Shenzhen an experiment for China as a whole. He declared China as a sort of Shenzhen as a testing ground for new entrepreneurial efforts to remake the nation. And Shenzhen was a success. And hence, this idea that experimentation would become a larger project really has been going on in China for a while. But this more recent project with making is now currently positioned as a way to finally complete that project of remaking the nation. And this effort in China really also has found substantial support by international collaborators and commentators. In a 2014 TED Talk, Joy Ito, the head of the MIT Media Lab, records his somewhat astonished impressions of Shenzhen after a tour to the city with his students as follows. He said, what was happening in Shenzhen? They were not making PowerPoints or prototypes, they were fiddling with the manufacturing equipment and innovating right there on the factory floor. The kids in Shenzhen were making new cell phones like the kids in Palo Alto were making websites. So there's a rainforest of innovation there. What you thought you could only do with software, they are doing with hardware. And similarly, Western media outlets like this one, this is Wired UK, that came up in an earlier talk with Aaron, portrays now Shenzhen as a rising innovation hub. So here, Wired UK calls Shenzhen the Silicon Valley for hardware. So what I've shown you so far is that through the making of things like the early Shenzhen map for makers, the Arduino, the open source rephone, it was the nation itself that became a design material, that became up for grabs. It was the vision to remake China as a whole that became tangibly and was made real. And the underlying goal here that brought together very unlikely allies like the Chinese government and makers and thinkers and activists was that the image of China itself could be changed globally. So some of you might have wondered, though, already, what motivated a collective of artists, makers, and activists to get on board with a project that went hand in hand with an increasingly neoliberal governance that had replaced within only 15 years a social security system in China with entrepreneurship, with an advocacy of startup culture that it very much so takes from Silicon Valley? So how was it possible, in other words, that a group of people who we very often think of as the counterculture came to align with a neoliberal project? The answer, I argue, and I'll end in a second there, is the answer lies in the lure of neoliberal projects of self-reliance, innovation, flexibility, especially when one turns to some of its epicenters like Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley or Hollywood or London are seen as models of change that appear hopeful in China and promising for China's future. So these stories of individual empowerment and of people living their dreams can't be but enticing, and especially when they evaporate from Silicon Valley. What is much harder to see, of course, in this story of change is the precarity and the discrimination that happens very much so in these technology innovation hubs like Silicon Valley. What happened at the same time, though, is Shenzhen became celebrated, especially by Western commentators like Choi Itu and others in Wired UK, as a Silicon Valley, is that the government also decided to change and upgrade its old informal economy infrastructure. So you see here the redesign of some of the urban infrastructures into glassy, shiny interfaces. Repair networks that actually are quite sustainable because they take broken phones and reuse existing parts of phones that are being, put in the waste in Europe and then get shipped back to China, are basically being recycled. These spaces are disappearing and are being replaced by maker spaces, incubators, spaces that kind of look like Silicon Valley. So to sum things up, for the people I worked with, though, making constituted an intervention into exactly this project of neoliberal governance, of replacing existing infrastructures with something that looks like Silicon Valley. So making an open source phone, starting a tech business, or running a hackerspace held the promise to transform China on their own terms and to counteract what they considered holding the nation back. So this was institutional hierarchies, passive societal structures, top-down decision-making, political control, and corporate monopoly. So China's makers endorsed making because they saw it exactly as an opportunity, as a hopeful project to intervene in the kind of neoliberal governance that China's politicians have set out over the last 20 years. So it was because of this belief that making constituted a unique opportunity for intervention into the workings of a very powerful authoritarian state that made their project seemingly aligned with the official rhetoric. So both the state and the grassroots were talking about the same things. They were both talking about making, and yet talked about in making in very different ways. So in order to understand why a collective of makers and activists, people who are typically thought of as the counterculture, seemingly aligned with official culture, I argue we need to move beyond typical constructs like the official system versus the counterculture or the resistance versus the government. In China, as much as elsewhere, projects of capitalism and projects of resistance stand ever less in a relation of opposition and increasingly take on a graded relationship. But it is here, I believe, where there lies an opportunity for us to intervene by moving beyond these modalities of distance critique. So it would be easy to just critique China's makers for saying, well, you just bought into the system and you're doing what the government is doing. So rather than this distant critique, I argue that especially for us commentators, researchers, and scholars and designers in the West, we should move towards an active participation in the kinds of projects like the ones I've shown you today, from the Arduino or the phones, of the Shanzhai phones, who envision, albeit imperfectly and incomplete, a world that can be otherwise. And with this, I would like to end, and here's some contact information of mine, so please feel free to also reach out to me after this talk, and I thank you so much for your attention.
Vielen Dank, Silvia. Sie verstehen jetzt also, warum ich mir das Video